Introduce the speaker.
All right. As Erica said, it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Margaret Walls here for the second of her two Ecology Center seminars. Dr. Walls got her undergraduate degree at University of Kentucky, and yesterday we learned that she got her PhD at UC Santa Barbara instead of somebody thought UC San Diego all these decades. Okay, she's currently a senior fellow at Resources for the Future, a Washington, D.C. based think tank that's highly influential in environmental policy. Yesterday, Margaret spoke to us about environmental justice dimensions of recent conservation policy initiatives proposed by the Biden administration. Today, we're going to see another aspect of her research pursuits, the economic and environmental consequences of public lands policy. In addition to the refereed papers that you can find in journals, those who are interested in the non-technical aspects of Margaret's extensive work on public lands, national parks, national monuments, that sort of thing, can just go to the RFF website, which has the very complicated web address of rff.org, put in Walls in the search thing, pop on that, and there it's all going to pop up for you. So if you're interested in sort of the non-technical aspects of her body of research, it's all right there. Great little website. And for now then, let's learn a little bit more about wildfire in Western United States.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Paul. I guess this is working, right? You can hear me? One of the things you'll find on our website is a blog post that Paul and I wrote together on national monuments. So that's in our research that he's done, that we've done independently, Paul and Shirzad sitting right here, on economic impacts of monument designations. So, but I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk about wildfires and smoke. So I'm going to say up front that the title is a little misleading because what I thought I was going to talk about was new work on economic impacts of fires. And in fact, I didn't get as much done ahead of coming here. So I have half the presentation on that and we'll welcome feedback. It's very much work in progress. I like to give work in progress because that's a good chance for you to give feedback and, you know, before the work is final. But the first half of the presentation is going to be the work on outdoor recreation and fire. And I know that some of you have read the paper, so maybe this will be repeat information for you, but that's what I'm going to talk about first. So sort of divided, this talk is divided into two topics, very related topics. And in fact, these first slides are going to relate them. So I'm going to talk about things you're very familiar with in Utah, the role of public lands in the outdoor recreation economy, and the clash between that and growing wildfire problems. Then I'll tell you some of our results on wildfire and smoke impacts on outdoor recreation, and then talk about that work in progress, which is really looking at impacts on jobs and things like that. So in that context, I'll just tell you about some preliminary results and the planned work that we're going to do instead of those preliminary results, and see if y'all have reactions to that. If time allows, I just said this to Jake, if I had known how many people here are doing outdoor recreation, there are other things I could have talked about. So if we have time at the end, you want to ask those questions or offer some things you're doing in these topics, I welcome that. I'll try not to take up the whole time on my stuff and we can have a conversation, but I have a paper on the outdoor recreation gear tax, and that's a finalized paper. So happy to talk about that. We have more wildfire work that's ongoing about land development, housing development in the wildland-urban interface and policies to reduce that. And of course, if you want to ask about national monuments, Paul will give you all the answers. Okay, so this is just a few facts that I'm preaching to people here that know a lot about this probably, but you know that outdoor recreation is really increasing. And boy, some of the conversations I've been having today really indicate that. And some of the conflicts that are happening between, we heard a great story today about the conflicts on the rivers between fly fishermen and rafters that are going down rivers because everybody's recreating now. And COVID has, I think, increased that. And visits to public lands are on the rise. The 6 highest visitation years on record at the National Park Service, that should say, are the 2014 to 2019. BLM lands have had an increase. Of course, they're harder to measure visitation there. And you probably know that now we have, the US government does an outdoor recreation economy satellite account, and they've been doing that for a few years now. and have calculated that outdoor recreation contributes to a little over 2% of US GDP, or $460 billion a year. In the West, it's even higher. So they now do state-specific calculations, and I put the Utah number up there. And now, I think we've talked about this yesterday too, 13 states have established offices of outdoor recreation, which are really economic focused, like tourism and trying to promote the economy. So the other thing that's going on is it's driving population growth. So there's several studies on this. There's some older studies that talk about this, and I've got some references there. And my own work on monuments has shown some increases in jobs that as a result of monument designations. There's a recent paper by Sabo and Ugeli, if I'm pronouncing that right, that is looking at economic impacts of national parks. And that's a pretty rich paper that looks at impacts on jobs, wages, and so forth. And I like to put up these graphs I made from Megan Lawson's paper that compares, this is not a cause and effect thing, but it's a paper where she looks at comparisons of what are classified as recreation counties. So the Economic Research Service at USDA classifies rural counties in different ways, well, all counties in different ways. And they have a category called recreation counties. And those, I think what goes into that is a percentage of public land. It's something about a percentage of your jobs and economic activity that's in certain sectors and stuff. So they have a whole system of doing that. And what she did is compare migration rates in rural counties. So rural county population has been declining, but not recreation rural counties. So let's see, what do we have here? The green bars are all the recreation counties. And you can see on the left, the population growth is going up, even for rural counties, which on the whole have had declining populations. And then also on the income side, their income moving in to counties that are recreation counties are on the rise. So this is just a backdrop to this work that I'm going to talk about. And this is also a backdrop. So wildfire is on the rise. This is a graph. There's various people that have shown this in different ways. This is a paper by Marshall Burke and colleagues at Berkeley who, or is he Stanford? I can't remember. Maybe it's at Stanford. Well, that was in PNAS just earlier this year. And so it's a graph of burned area based on National Interagency Fire Center data and shows the kind of upward trajectory. Of course, it goes up and down by year. That paper, well, I'll get to that on the next slide. It hit some other findings in that study. But another fact, of course, that you know is that most of that acreage is on public lands. 70% in 2020 was on federal lands. And the 2021 numbers are 2.6 million hectares. So you can kind of see where that would be on the graph. This is a map my colleague, Matt Wibbenmeyer, made because we're using this data. So the smoke, satellites provide daily smoke plume data. And we've used that. That's the data we're using in our studies, along with the fire data, which I'll talk about in a minute. And he created these maps that show by county across the entire US, the number of population weighted days per year where a county's covered with a smoke plume. And I just really like these maps because, of course, right away you can see the 2021. So he did this as of, I think, like August or September, and they're consistent. They're the same number of days counted in each year. I think there's just some interesting things here. In others, you can see the smoke is not really just a Western phenomenon, especially in some years. And I think that's maybe fires in Canada to a certain extent. Certainly this year, there was a lot of smoke in the East. I think I have a couple more trends on this. Is taking that same data and just showing the average number of smoky days per county per year. So it goes up and down. If you looked back farther in time, this graph would be even more sharply upward sloping. So, and then this is what the distribution looks like across all the years by county. So, you know, the 30 is the average, but there's a lot of counties that get a lot more smoky days than that. So the main thing that the Burke et al. Paper is about how wildfire smoke is contributing to air pollution. And they find that it now accounts for about 50% of PM 2.5 exposure in many parts of the Western US, compared to less than 20% a decade ago. So it's just becoming a more important contributor to air pollution. The other studies that have been come out, and there was one that got a lot of press in the news this year, that Aguilera et al. Paper. There's some evidence that the health effects from smoke may be worse than those from conventional sources of PM 2.5. And there's other studies that are showing, and these are in the few years older, that show that PM 2.5 is having health effects more than we used to think, even below regulatory limits. So, there's just more and more evidence coming out that smoke is really bad for you. The Aguilera paper is I think that's another PNAS or no, Nature paper, I think Nature Sustainability or something. And they kind of isolate the effect of smoke from other sources, and they're looking in California, and they look at hospitalizations for respiratory problems. So that's the focus of their study, and they are finding that smoke has worse effects. So, and then this Reed et al. Is an older paper, but they look across a set of studies and show that there's effects on mortality. So it's particularly a problem for outdoor recreation, really for three reasons. Most fires take place and most smoke exists where people are recreating. Most fires take place when people are recreating. And most recreationists are outside breathing it. So this is why I think it's important to look at this recreation and smoke intersection. There's an older study there's a couple of studies I've seen that find that the health benefits of exercise may be offset by the negative health effects of pollution. And that's an older study of Coric et al. That I can't remember the methods of right now, but obviously that's a question you'd ask, right? Like, I'm going for a run, that's really good for me, but I'm breathing in all the PM 2.5, that's not good for me. So there's people looking at that question, and I think it's mixed results. There's another study that finds that it's not offset, but that one finds that it is so. So this is what we're doing on this topic, and this is joint work with Jacob Gelman, who's a PhD student at UC Santa Barbara, and Matt Wibbenmeyer, my colleague at RFF. And we take the data from the recreation.gov website. In fact, we got a special download from the contractor that works with the Forest Service managing that data. And that provided us with a bunch of individual records of campsite reservations. The special download, we got cancellations, and we have transaction dates for all the transactions that people are making. And in this study, we aggregated the data to the campground level and looked at the West only. And we merged this with wildfire. So it's daily data on campground use, campsite use in campgrounds. And we merged this with fire and smoke data. So the fire data there are two sources for this. The MODIS daily fire detection data, which is picking up every fire, including small ones, which we don't really want to capture. So and my colleague Matt is much more familiar with the pros and cons of various sources of fire data and what it can give you. But we filter that data by the USGS monitoring trends and burn severity, the MTBS data set, so that we're not using the little small fires that are in there. But this is also daily data, and we have the fire perimeters, and So, and then we also use the smoke plume data, which I mentioned earlier. In this paper, what we did with that data is, so with the smoke plume data, if you're familiar with it, it just is from satellites, it measures whether there's a smoke plume in the column, as I understand it. It could tell you that there's smoke, but it's high up and it isn't really affecting air quality. So it's, what we do is something one other person did in another paper, is we don't count all the smoke plumes as smoke. We take the smoke plumes and combine it with interpolated EPA ground level monitor data. And to be specific, what we do is if the ground level monitors show on a given day with the smoke plume that the monitor reading is above the 95th percentile of the average for that area on non-smoky days, we call it a smoky day. It's pretty conservative. So we do some results with just the plumes too. And what we're doing is just estimating the total number of people affected over a 10-year period. So this is almost like calculations, not estimation. And then we look at avoidance behavior and we estimate regressions of cancellation rates and campground occupancy rates as a function of fire and smoke to see if people are altering their behavior because of fire and smoke. So here's the first set of results, and this is the number of camper days per year with a fire nearby. And in this graph is showing you just within 20 kilometers. We do some other distances too, or under adverse smoke conditions. And a few things, and then the colors are different regions of the country. So first things first, a lot more people are affected by smoke than a fire. About a little under 400,000 people per year on average across this 10-year period we're looking at are camping under adverse smoke conditions. And so when I say they're camping, we take all that reservation data. If they canceled, we net them out. So it's supposedly the people who were there camping. I think, you know, the other things, and you know this too, probably if you know anything about smoke, is California has a lot of fires. A lot of that smoke goes up to the north and east. So the Northern Rockies and the Pacific Northwest are pretty big chunks of that right-hand bar. And in fact, they're the largest percentage of camper days affected. And that's because they have shorter seasons. So the denominator is big in California because there's a lot of camping, a lot of sites, and a longer season. And in the north, it's less. So although a lot of the yellow is big on that smoke bar graph, because that's California, as a percentage, the Northern Rockies and the Pacific Northwest is the biggest hit from smoke. And then just the last bullet there, if we just use the smoke plumes and not do that adjustment, we get about 1.6 million camper days affected. So a lot more. So our adjustment is really bringing these numbers down. I think when we did that adjustment, we thought that was the right thing to do. And the paper has that as the main results. In further thinking, I'm wondering if that's too conservative, having been in the West this summer in the smoke, but anyway. We also took our numbers and scaled them for the national parks in our sample to all visitors, because these are just campers. And about 400,000 visitors per year are affected by fire in these 33 national parks in our sample, or about 1 million visitors affected by smoke. And here's what we did on the avoidance behavior stuff. So we ran panel fixed effects regressions at the individual campground level. And we looked at three things actually, but I'm only going to show 2 of them here. The occupancy rate, so the number of campsites that are being used as a share of all the sites, all the campsites in the campground. And then the daily cancellation rate, the share of reservations that are canceled within 1 week of arrival. So these are people who made their booking, and then do they cancel as a result of smoke or fire? That's the equation for it. So like most economists, we have these fixed effects approaches are netting out a lot of the other things that could be affecting it, right? Because we have fixed effects. If you look at my FEs down there, individual campground fixed effects, week of year fixed effects, day of week fixed effects, an indicator if it's a holiday, and recreation area. So that would be like the national park or a forest ranger district by month of year and recreation year. What this is, you're not economists and maybe doing this kind of work, but it's just controlling for tons of different things that could be affecting campground use at a specific site. So, you know, this regression doesn't have things like characteristics of the campground, because that's all soaked up in those fixed effects. And we can isolate the smoke and fire effects. We also have precipitation and temperature, though, because we have those on a daily basis, and we use those in the model to control for that. And so this is what we get. Fire and smoke do have the statistically significant effects on the use of these campsites. They reduce occupancy rates and they increase cancellation rates. However, the effects are pretty small for smoke in particular. And I know this is something you all talked about when you discussed this paper, some of you. So smoky conditions cause about a 1.1 percentage point decline in occupancy rates. So the mean occupancy rate across the whole sample is 30.6%. And as a result of smoke, it would go down to 29.5%. So it isn't really causing very much change in people's use of campgrounds. So why is this is an open question, because we know this past summer, lots of people did make adjustments to their plans, and there have been a lot of stories in the press and so forth about this. So a few things I would say is, first of all, these are average results across the entire West over a 10-year period. So, you know, this past year was very bad. It was a very bad year compared to other years. So maybe, and people are learning more about smoke and the effects of smoke. So I think maybe going forward, we might see bigger effects. It'd be interesting to know. We will admit that the cancellation data we have might not be fully reflecting people canceling. We do see cancellations in the data. You get your money back if you cancel. So, you know, and we have some of our campgrounds report no-shows. So we have that in the data. And we've done some robustness checks to see if we only look at those, do we get the same results? And we do. But we will admit, you know, people don't show up sometimes. So that's a thing we're missing. But we think one thing that's happening is it's hard to get in a lot of sites in the middle of summer, especially the national parks, which are so popular. And people, you know, book way in advance. And that little graph on the right is from an earlier paper I did with the rec.gov data, where we looked at the reservations booked. Those are 3 years shown, 2014, 15, and 16. And that's the share of the sites that are booked as Zion, and several other of the most popular parks look the same. And throughout the summer, this just booked up, right? So if you don't go because it's smoky, you're not going to get in the rest of the summer. Yes, my one idea is if it's somewhere you've been dying to go, you booked it 6 months ago, you got on rec.gov and booked it, you've made all your plans, maybe you're just not going to cancel. Like, you're like just going to breathe the smoke. I don't know. So that we did look at that a little bit by looking at our regressions by popularity of sites. And we do see a little bit of that in our results. But anyway, it's an interesting finding, I think, and could change going forward. You know, as economists, we like to calculate what welfare losses are, how much worse people are off in a dollar term from smoke. And I just want to point out one thing about that. I won't go through the details of how we can do this welfare loss calculation, but one component of it is health effects, and one component is you had to change your plans and you didn't get to do your trip. That's a welfare loss, like you didn't get to go, so that there's some value to that, lost value. And most of it, because most people aren't canceling, is from the health effects. And that health effects number we get from some other studies, and we multiply it by our numbers of recreationists to get that. What's missing from that is any losses people have from just a less pleasant experience. If you go and you don't have the view, we're not picking that up. And that's a loss you experience. Also, if you just don't feel well while you're there and you never go to the doctor, like there's some health costs there, but if there's no health costs, you didn't go to the doctor or anything, that's also missing. And you might not feel well. So I would say that's a lower bound probably. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit, if that's okay, and talk about the economic impacts part of the work, which I had hoped to have more to say about, but I have some stuff to say. So in recent years, I mean, wildfires are mostly out in forested areas away from people, but in recent years, we've been having more fires occur where people live and damaging properties and even killing people. And the Camp Fire in California killed 80 people, I think, and caused a lot of damage. So we've been seeing more and more of these in recent years. And that's partly due to increasing fires, but it's also due to increasing development in the wildland-urban interface and increased exposure. So there's some literature on the economic impacts of natural disasters, natural hazards. Most of that literature is focused on flooding and hurricanes. I know of kind of two wildfire papers. Nielsen Pincus does something most relevant to what we're doing. They look at county level data over just a 5-year period and look at effects on employment growth rates from fires. And what they find is that fires have an initial increase, and they have monthly data. So fires initially increase employment because of suppression expenditures and people and repairs. They find this in the literature on hurricanes as well. A lot of times is there's construction activity. So the construction sector goes up. I think one major, and then they say a decrease, but that decrease that they find coincides right with the Great Recession. So like 28, I can't remember, 2008, 2009. So it's a little unclear if they're really picking up, in my opinion, what they're picking up. The Wang et al. Paper is a new paper. That's another Nature or PNAS paper. And they showed that a large economic impact from California fires. And what their big finding is that most of that is indirect effects from a multiplier effect. Like fire has an impact in California, but it just ripples throughout the economy. And a lot of those effects were outside the state. Personally, for me, those results are based on an input-output model simulation. They use InPlan, I think. So whatever you put as assumptions in that model generates the outputs you get. It's not statistically based on the data. So it's an interesting finding, and I need to read it more carefully, but I think it's better to, in my opinion, try to tease these impacts out from the data and see what you can find, and not just run a model that's building in those multiplier effects and then show that you have big effects outside of the state. So here's what we're doing. We have data called the National Establishment Time Series Database, and this is an annual 30-year panel of every individual establishment in the US. So every Walmart, every Crumb Brothers bakery, everything is in there. And they're geolocated. And we know a lot of detail about what industry they're in. And we know their employment in every year. So it's annual data. We know a few other things. We know if they're minority or woman-owned. I haven't used that part of the data. If it's a publicly traded company on the stock exchange, and something called the credit scores, Paydex credit scores. So if you want to ask questions about this data later, I can answer it, but that's the source of the data. It's micro data on every business. And then again, we have this smoke and fire data that we use. And what so far at the beginning here, what I'm going to show you some results of is that, remember the maps of the smoke and those per county level, total smoky days per county per year. We're going to use that and do some county level regressions. I'm going to show you those results. So we created the number of acres burned and as a percent of county land area, the number of people burned. So what we did there is like, we know the population, locations of population by census tract, and we overlay the fire with the census tract to get sort of where people are vis-a-vis the fire. So not just use acres burned. And then that smoke plume data, which I showed you earlier. So that's the count of population weighted smoke. So we're not just counting all the smoke, but it's smoke where people are, not all the fires where people are. And this is joint work in progress, again, with my colleague, Matt Wibbenmeyer. So this is what we're doing first. We're doing these more fixed effects regressions at the county level. All the counties in the continental Western US and all the fires from 1990 to 2018. And we are looking at growth rates in establishments and growth rates in employment. And we use these two this is just fire, no smoke. So the fire variables, the percent of the county population in the burn area of each fire, and an indicator for whether that figure is greater than 10% of the county population. And that's the results I'm going to show you. It's the second bullet one. So those are the two regressions down there. And what we're going to look at is sort of leads and lags, like look before the fire and after the fire, what are the effects of the fire? And that's to see how the effects play out over the next few years after the fire. And looking pre-fire just as like a placebo test to make sure we're not seeing results beforehand. It's kind of a common practice. So,
can I ask a clarifying question? Can you explain percent of county in the burn population in the burn area?
So that is, we know the location of the fire, and we overlay that with where the population is, and we know the total county population. So we calculate the percentage of the population of the county that's in that area. Yeah. Okay, we can come back to that, Paul. It's not very, these numbers are small because we don't have people affected by fires a lot. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's where I was going.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm. So this is what it looks like by state, on average across the whole time period and this is showing you just the land area and the percent this population weighted thing that we came up with. A lot of times in a county in a year won't have any fires, but sometimes there's big fire, there's a lot. So the percentage can go quite high in some cases. Up to 50% is the highest it can get. But on average, across all counties and years across the West, the percentage is pretty small. Because those zeros are in there. So these are preliminary results. So remember I said that we have the pre side. So before 0 is before the fire hits, 0 is the date of the fire, and then there's 4 years after the fire. And what you're supposed to see here is the dots are the coefficient estimates of that regression. So that's the effect on average of the fire on the growth rate of establishments and the growth rate of employment. And the band is the 95% confidence interval around that estimate. So what if there's a negative effect of these fires on economic outcomes? You would expect to see after the 0, the point estimates on the trend going down. So far we do see that a little bit. Noisy estimates because the confidence band goes up pretty, it's pretty wide. And this is the results with that indicator for whether more than 10% of the county is affected by the fire. The magnitude, so the average growth rate in establishments year to year is 0.7%. The average growth rate in employment, annual growth rate in employment is 1.2%, I think. So growth rates are not that high. They're not over the sample period. There's not a lot of growth period, but so you can look at the magnitudes. They're about 0.02 on employment, let's say over a 1.2% average growth rate. So 0.2%. Well, let me stop, and that's just saying it like that. So the average is 1.2. That drop, those point estimates are between 0 and minus 0.2 or minus a little bit below 0.02, sorry. So what we really wanted to do, what I think we want to do, and I would love to get your feedback, is we don't want to do things at the county level. We have all these individual establishments. We know where they are. So this is a very messy figure. I'll go to, this is just Colorado so far that we've done, but these are the largest 10 fires in Colorado that are in our sample period. And these are perimeters we drew around them, buffers we drew around the fire perimeter. And all those messy dots, the black or dark blue, are the individual establishments. So let me focus in on one of them. Sorry, let me go forward and then I'll come back to that. So this is what the Hayman fire looks like. The Hayman fire was the biggest fire in Colorado history until last year. And there's Denver up there. So it's pretty close to populated areas. And it burned 137,000 acres, 138,000. And the purple area is the perimeter of the fire. And then we just did some buffer calculations, and then we plotted the businesses within these buffers. So, and we did this, let me go to the next one. So this are 2 other big fires. Bridger burned 46,000 acres, but it's in a very remote area, so there's hardly any businesses there. And Waldo Canyon is actually much smaller. It wasn't even in the top 10. We just stuck it in there because it impacted a lot of people and properties. It's near Colorado Springs. And you can see, even though it's quite a bit smaller, it's near a lot of stuff. So let me see if this graph was of any use. Oh, I just wanted to show this. So the line is kind of a weird graph, but the line is the acres burned, and it's these fires are ordered from biggest to smallest in terms of acres. So Hayman was the biggest, Waldo Canyon was the smallest. And the bars are showing the level of employment that's within these buffers, within 50K, 50 kilometers, and within 20 kilometers. And I just want to point out a couple things. First, that acres burned is not always perfectly correlated with the number of businesses that are in harm's way. So the impacts are not just based on acres. I mean, that's obvious, but we're just showing it here because we know this data shows where the businesses are. The other thing is like this perimeter, this buffer that and I'm going to show you what we think we're going to do with the buffers. It's really going to matter because within 20, look at the Hayman, there were lots of people, lots of jobs and lots of businesses within 50K of that fire, but hardly any within 20K. Whereas Waldo Canyon, there was a lot within 20 and within 50. So, that's just illustrating how some fires are so much closer to where people are. And so we're thinking about using these buffers in a certain way I'm going to tell you about. And now I'm like, well, which buffer do you use? But let me go forward a little bit with this. So I don't have results to show you. This is what I'm thinking we might do because we have this individual establishments. We want to look at employment at each establishment. Does that change? And what's the probability the business is still in existence after the fire? So something like, sorry, I have to put math up. So there's what the regression would look like. Another one of these leads and lags thing. And we might do something like so Y on the left-hand variable would be either or both. We would do two things. The number of employees in establishment I, in a particular industry S, in year T, or it would be an indicator for whether that business survived, that was around in the previous period, is still around in the next period. Did they get knocked out of business because of the fire or not? And one idea is to look at that as a function of distance to the fire, or perhaps were you in one of those buffers, just an indicator, some measure of distance. And in this regression, it would be a continuous measure of distance, but maybe we would do, are you in the buffer? And then we'd have a lot of these fixed effects again to control for various things like the county and the industry that they're in. And put some other potential controls for, like, you might want to know how long has that business been in business and does that affect their probability of survival? Things that we know in the data, are they an independent business or are they linked to a headquarters somewhere like a Walmart? So we could control for that. So we might have a few things that we would add to this regression to pick up this probability of survival. So I'll get your reactions to that, but let me just tell you a little bit about the other literature. So the one paper I really have not seen, because a lot of times people don't have this micro data on businesses. I don't really see a lot of papers in the literature that are looking at this, but that one paper looks at the effects of Hurricane Katrina on business survival rates. And what they find, that's a picture of damage from Hurricane Katrina in Mississippi. Hurricane Katrina was really bad. So one concern I have about our work is that wildfires are just not going to do as much damage as things like hurricanes. And so, darn it. But I mean, like we may have trouble picking stuff up. So I'd just be interested in your reactions to that. But what they found is that there was a big decrease in the survival probability in areas that experienced the most damage. So they were able to kind of map out where the worst damage was, and they looked at their findings based on that. But they did find differences across different types of businesses. And so they have smaller, this decrease in survival probability was smaller if they were a larger business, if they were older, they'd been around longer, and more productive. And I forget exactly how they're measuring productivity. They had some data I don't think we have on measuring output per worker. They also had data on credit card use by businesses, and they found that had a big effect. So businesses that relied on credit cards had an even bigger decrease in the survival probability. So they were credit constrained businesses that had to rely on credit to get by, and they were more likely to go under. We have some credit score information, so we could kind of look at that if we, not exactly the same thing they did, but we could look at that. So I have open questions for you all, and then I'm going to stop talking. One is I'm wondering if proximity to the fire is really the right measure of impacts of the fire. So there's some literature on hurricanes that's found impacts through supply chains, and we're not able to look at that, but also some effects within firms across establishments in different areas. So for firms that have establishments in different locations, one of which is in the fire, they find ripple effects in the other businesses. So like, is proximity to the fire really what a measure of exposure to the problem? And that Wang et al. Study I mentioned earlier, I don't like the in-plan use, but nonetheless, they're finding these big effects of California fires outside of California. So, that would suggest don't use those buffers to look at impacts. So, and then there's a paper that's on the Hayman fire. That paper isn't really useful for us, but they define things as a primary and secondary impact area of the fire. They don't explain how they come up with those, but it's a thought to think about. Maybe there's a way to do something like that. Just a couple other concerns you can react to. One is you do have this effect from disasters where there's usually an increase in spending and jobs and sometimes wages when a disaster occurs, because in the case of fire, there's fire suppression activity, and also there's rehabilitation activities afterwards. In hurricanes, there's rebuilding. So there's, like, you kind of want to, you can look at that, like that's a real impact, but in a way you want the sort of long run thing. So I just kind of thinking about that in the context of fire, should we net it out or something? And then just any reactions you might have about alternative output measures. So our idea is looking at jobs per establishment and survival probabilities, but maybe there's other things we should be looking at that are economic in nature. Yeah, so I'll just leave it at that. No, that's it. So thank you for listening, and be interested in your questions or comments. Comments welcome as much as questions.